Commander Sarah Phoenix Martinez had never failed to bring a pilot home. In 12 years of naval aviation, she had guided hundreds of aircraft through impossible weather, mechanical failures, and combat situations that would have broken lesser aviators. Her voice over the radio had become legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet. Calm, precise, and absolutely unshakable, even when death was measured in seconds, rather than minutes. At 34, Sarah commanded the Air Traffic Control Center. Aboard the USS Constellation, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that served as the floating headquarters for the Navy's most advanced fighter operations in the Western Pacific. Her steel blue eyes had watched aircraft approach through Category 4 hurricanes. Her steady hands had guided damaged FA-18 Super Hornets through zero-visibility landings, and her tactical mind had coordinated air operations that saved entire battle groups from disaster. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The carrier's island superstructure rose 7 stories above the flight deck, and Sarah's domain occupied the nerve center, where multiple radar screens displayed aircraft positions across hundreds of miles of ocean. Banks of communication equipment connected her to pilots, ship systems, and command centers around the world. Every piece of technology had been designed to give her the tools necessary to control air operations in the most challenging maritime environment on Earth. Sarah's background set her apart from typical air traffic controllers. She had started her naval career as a fighter pilot herself, flying FA-18 Hornets off carrier decks for 6 years, before a training accident damaged her inner ear and ended her flying career. The injury had grounded her permanently, but it had also given her something invaluable: the perspective of someone who understood exactly what pilots experience during carrier operations. Her transition from cockpit to control tower had been seamless because she spoke the language that aviators understood. She knew the feeling of approaching a carrier deck at 150 knots with a 30-foot margin for error. She understood the physical and psychological demands of night landings when the horizon disappeared into black water. Most importantly, she could anticipate pilot reactions under stress because she had lived through every scenario herself. The calcine Phoenix had originated during her flying days, earned after she successfully ejected from a burning Hornet and returned to flight status within 6 months. But the name had taken on new meaning in her current role. Pilots throughout the fleet knew that Phoenix could resurrect seemingly hopeless situations, bringing aircraft home when other controllers would have written them off as lost. Her reputation had been built on a foundation of technical expertise that few people possessed. Sarah held advanced degrees in aeronautical engineering and meteorology, knowledge that allowed her to understand aircraft performance and weather patterns with scientific precision. She could calculate fuel consumption rates, predict wind shear effects, and assess structural limitations while simultaneously coordinating complex air traffic patterns. The USS Constellation operated in some of the most challenging maritime environments on the planet. The Western Pacific presented weather conditions that ranged from tropical typhoons to Arctic storm systems, often with minimal warning. Ocean swells could exceed 40 feet, wind speeds could reach hurricane force, and visibility could drop to 0 within minutes. Managing air operations under these conditions required skills that went far beyond conventional air traffic control. Sarah's team consisted of 12 highly trained specialists who monitored different aspects of carrier operations. Radar operators tracked aircraft positions and weather patterns. Communication technicians maintained contact with multiple aircraft simultaneously. Navigation specialists calculated approach vectors and landing sequences. Each person represented years of specialized training, but Sarah was the central coordinator who synthesized all information into split-second decisions that meant the difference between successful recovery and disaster. The carrier's flight deck measured only 1,092 feet in length, with an angled landing area that gave pilots approximately 500 feet to catch one of 4 arresting cables stretched across the deck. Missing all 4 cables meant executing a bolter full throttle to take off again and attempt another approach. The margin for error was so small that even experienced pilots considered carrier landings one of the most demanding tasks in aviation. Night operations multiplied the difficulty exponentially. Without visual references to the horizon, pilots relied entirely on instrument readings and the carrier's optical landing system, a series of lights that provided glide slope guidance. The Fresnel lens optical landing system, known as the meatball, showed pilots whether they were on the correct approach path, but interpreting the lights required experience and absolute precision. Weather added another layer of complexity that could transform routine operations into life-threatening emergencies. The carrier's movement through heavy seas created a deck that pitched, rolled, and heaved unpredictably. Wind across the deck could vary by 30 knots within seconds. Rain and spray could obscure visibility completely. Under these conditions, Sarah's voice became the most important link between pilots and survival. Her communication style had been refined through thousands of hours of high-stress situations. She never raised her voice, never showed uncertainty, and never provided information that wasn't absolutely accurate. Pilots knew that when Phoenix spoke, her words carried the authority of someone who understood their situation completely. Her instructions were precise, her timing was perfect, and her judgment was trusted throughout the fleet. The technology at Sarah's disposal represented the most advanced air traffic control systems in the world. Primary and secondary radar provided aircraft positions with incredible accuracy. Weather radar showed storm systems and precipitation intensity across hundreds of miles. Automatic carrier landing systems could guide aircraft to the deck even when human pilots were incapacitated. But all of this equipment was only as effective as the person who coordinated its use. Sarah's daily routine began 4 hours before flight operations commenced. She reviewed weather forecasts, studied aircraft maintenance status, and coordinated with the ship's navigation team about course and speed adjustments that would optimize wind conditions for takeoffs and landings. Every detail mattered because carrier aviation operated with such small safety margins that minor oversights could become catastrophic failures. The pilots who flew from the Constellation represented the elite of naval aviation. Each had undergone years of training that began with basic flight instruction and progressed through increasingly demanding phases of carrier qualification. They had demonstrated the ability to land on a moving deck in daylight, darkness, and adverse weather. They had proven their skills in combat situations and emergency scenarios. Yet even these exceptional aviators relied on Sarah's expertise when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Aircraft carrier operations required coordination between multiple departments that functioned like a small city at sea. The Air Department managed flight deck operations and aircraft handling. The Engineering Department maintained the ship's propulsion and electrical systems. The Navigation Department determined the course and speed. The Meteorology Department provided weather analysis. Sarah's position required her to synthesize information from all these sources into decisions that affected the entire air wing. Her personal flying experience gave her credibility that purely administrative controllers could never achieve. When she told a pilot to adjust their approach angle or modify their airspeed, they knew the recommendation came from someone who had performed the same maneuvers under similar conditions. Her suggestions carried the weight of hard-earned experience. Rather than theoretical knowledge, the psychological aspect of Sarah's role was equally important as the technical elements. Pilots facing emergency situations needed to hear confidence and competence in the voice guiding them home. Panic was contagious in high-stress environments, but so was calm professionalism. Sarah's ability to project absolute confidence, even during the most desperate circumstances, had a stabilizing effect that allowed pilots to focus on executing the precise procedures necessary for survival. Training exercises conducted throughout the fleet had tested Sarah's capabilities under simulated emergency conditions. She had guided aircraft through engine failures, hydraulic system malfunctions, and structural damage scenarios. Each exercise added to her repertoire of solutions and reinforced her reputation as someone who could handle any situation that naval aviation might present. The USS Constellation's position in the Western Pacific meant that real emergencies occurred with disturbing regularity. Tropical storm systems developed with minimal warning, creating conditions that challenged even the most experienced pilots. Mechanical failures happened without regard to weather conditions, often forcing emergency landings during the worst possible circumstances. Sarah had handled all of these situations, building a track record of success that made her the first choice for coordinating high-risk operations. Her quarters aboard the carrier reflected the intensity of her professional focus. Technical manuals filled every available shelf. Weather charts covered the walls. Aircraft performance data occupied her desk. Even during off-duty hours, Sarah continued studying the factors that influenced carrier aviation safety. Her dedication bordered on obsession, but that commitment had saved lives when split-second decisions determined survival. The evening that would test everything, Sarah had learned, began like countless others, with routine flight operations scheduled. Despite deteriorating weather conditions, storm systems in the Western Pacific developed rapidly, and what had appeared to be manageable conditions during afternoon briefings were evolving into something far more dangerous. Sarah monitored weather reports with growing concern, knowing that aircraft scheduled to return to the carrier would face conditions that pushed the limits of safe operations. As she prepared for what promised to be a challenging night of air traffic control, Sarah had no way of knowing that she was about to face a situation that would test every skill she had developed during 12 years of naval aviation. The approaching storm was bringing more than dangerous weather. It was carrying a crisis that would require her to reach beyond everything she thought she knew about guiding aircraft home. Lieutenant Jake "Maverick" Thompson had been dreaming of this moment for 8 years. At 26, he was finally flying his first operational mission as a newly qualified FA-18 Super Hornet pilot aboard the USS Constellation. His boyish face still showed traces of the excitement that had carried him through flight school, carrier qualification, and the grueling training that had brought him to this point. Tonight's mission was supposed to be routine, a simple combat air patrol over international waters that would give him experience flying from a carrier deck in operational conditions. The weather briefing that afternoon had mentioned deteriorating conditions, but nothing that seemed beyond the capabilities of modern naval aviation. Tropical storm Helena was moving through the region, bringing increased winds and scattered precipitation, but the forecast indicated that conditions would remain within acceptable parameters for flight operations. Jake had trained in similar weather during his qualification period, and his instructor pilots had expressed confidence in his abilities. Jake's Super Hornet, Bureau number 168,934, was equipped with the latest avionics and navigation systems that made flying in challenging conditions significantly easier than previous generations of naval aircraft. The aircraft's fly-by-wire flight controls automatically compensated for turbulence and wind variations. Its radar could penetrate weather systems to provide accurate navigation information. The heads-up display projected critical flight data directly onto the windscreen, allowing pilots to maintain situational awareness even in reduced visibility conditions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His mission assignment placed him in the number 2 position of a 2-aircraft patrol. Flying wingman to Lieutenant Commander Rick "Stallion" Davis, a veteran pilot with over 1,200 carrier landings and 6 years of operational experience. Davis had been specifically assigned to fly with rookie pilots during their initial operational periods, providing mentorship and guidance that helped new aviators transition from training environments to real-world operations. The pre-flight briefing had covered standard procedures for combat air patrol missions, departure times, navigation routes, communication frequencies, and contingency procedures for various emergency scenarios. Jake had memorized every detail, understanding that thorough preparation was essential for successful carrier operations. His flight suit contained backup navigation charts, emergency frequency cards, and approach plates for multiple airfields. In case diversion became necessary, launch operations began at 1900 hours, as the sun was setting over the western Pacific. Jake's Super Hornet was positioned on Catapult 3, with steam pressure building in the launch system that would accelerate his aircraft from 0 to 150 knots in less than 3 seconds. The catapult launch was a violent experience that new pilots never quite got used to. The sudden acceleration pressed them deep into their ejection seats while their aircraft went from stationary to flying. Speed in the length of a football field. As Jake's aircraft cleared the carrier's bow and climbed into the darkening sky, he felt the satisfaction that came with successfully executing a carrier launch. The transition from deck to flight was always dramatic, but tonight's launch had been textbook perfect. His aircraft systems were functioning normally, weather conditions were manageable, and he was flying beside an experienced instructor who could provide guidance if needed. The patrol route took them 200 miles northeast of the carrier, following a predetermined track that would keep them in position to intercept any aircraft approaching the battle group. Jake's radar showed normal air traffic patterns with commercial aircraft following established airways well clear of military operating areas. The routine nature of the mission allowed him to focus on perfecting his formation flying skills while maintaining the precise navigation that carrier operations demanded. Lieutenant Commander Davis maintained steady radio communication, providing tips on fuel management, navigation techniques, and tactical procedures that weren't covered in classroom instruction. Jake absorbed every piece of advice, understanding that operational experience with a seasoned pilot was invaluable for developing the judgment that separated competent aviators from exceptional ones. 2 hours into the patrol, weather conditions began deteriorating more rapidly than forecast models had predicted. Tropical Storm Helena was intensifying and changing direction, bringing stronger winds and heavier precipitation toward their operating area. Jake noticed increased turbulence that required more aggressive control inputs to maintain formation position. The smooth air that had characterized the early portion of their flight was being replaced by increasingly rough conditions. "Maverick, you're getting a little loose on the formation," Davis advised over the radio. "These bumps are going to get worse. Tighten up your scan and stay focused on small control inputs." Jake acknowledged the instruction and concentrated on maintaining proper position relative to Davis's aircraft. The turbulence was unlike anything he had experienced during training flights, requiring constant attention to keep his Super Hornet in the correct formation geometry. His workload was increasing as he divided attention between formation flying, navigation monitoring, and systems management. The first indication that their situation was becoming serious came from the carrier's air traffic control center, Sarah. Martinez's voice came through their headsets with information that immediately changed the complexity of their mission. "Ghost flight. Be advised that weather conditions at the ship are deteriorating faster than forecast. Current winds are gusting to 35 knots with rain squalls reducing visibility to less than 2 miles. We're continuing flight operations, but recovery may be challenging." Davis acknowledged the transmission while Jake processed the implications of what they had just heard. Challenging carrier landings were significantly different from the controlled conditions he had experienced during training. Variable winds reduced visibility, and a pitching deck would test every skill he had developed during his qualification. Period. Don't worry about it, Maverick, Davis said over their tactical frequency. Phoenix runs the best air traffic control operation in the fleet. She'll get us aboard safely. But Jake's concern was growing as he monitored weather radar, returns that showed the storm system intensifying around their position. What had been scattered precipitation was consolidating into organized thunderstorm cells with precipitation, cores that indicated severe turbulence and possible icing conditions. The storm was no longer the manageable weather system described in their mission briefing. 20 minutes later, the situation deteriorated dramatically. Davis's aircraft suffered a catastrophic electrical failure that knocked out most of his avionics and rendered his aircraft incapable of instrument flight. Emergency procedures required him to immediately begin a descent toward the nearest available airfield, while Jake maintained visual contact to provide navigation assistance. "Maverick, I've lost most of my electrical system," Davis transmitted. "I need you to stay with me and help navigate to Kadena Air Base. We're declaring an emergency and diverting immediately." Jake's training had covered emergency procedures for accompanying distressed aircraft, but he had never performed the role under actual operational conditions. His responsibilities now included maintaining visual contact with Davis, providing navigation information, communicating with air traffic control facilities, and managing his own aircraft systems while flying in increasingly turbulent conditions. Diversion to Kadena Air Base required flying through the edge of the storm system that was continuing to intensify around their position. Jake found himself managing tasks that pushed his experience level to its absolute limit. Precise navigation through severe weather, RADIO coordination with multiple agencies, fuel management calculations, and formation flying with a damaged aircraft that was having difficulty maintaining stable flight as they approached the storm's outer bands. Turbulence became severe enough to make formation flying extremely difficult. Jake struggled to maintain visual contact with Davis's aircraft, while keeping his own Super Hornet under control in conditions that were rapidly exceeding anything he had encountered during training. Wind shears were creating sudden changes in airspeed and altitude that required immediate corrective action. "I can't maintain visual contact in these conditions," Jake transmitted to Davis. "The turbulence is too severe for close formation." Davis acknowledged the transmission and authorized Jake to increase separation while maintaining radio contact. But the decision to separate meant that Jake was now flying alone through a storm system that was continuing to worsen, with responsibility for navigating to an unfamiliar airfield while monitoring Davis's progress through the same dangerous weather. The approach to Kadena Air Base became a nightmare of severe turbulence, wind shear, and reduced visibility that tested every aspect of Jake's flying skills. His aircraft was being thrown around by atmospheric conditions that were beyond anything covered in training scenarios. Rain was so heavy that it overwhelmed his windscreen wipers, and lightning was close enough to create static interference. On his radio communications, Davis managed to land safely at Kadena despite his electrical problems. But Jake's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His fuel state was reaching the point where return to the carrier was no longer possible. But weather conditions at Kadena were deteriorating to the point where approach and landing would be extremely hazardous for a pilot with his limited experience. Kadena Tower, Ghost 2-1 requesting approach clearance. Jake transmitted while fighting to keep his aircraft under control in turbulence that was approaching the limits of structural tolerance. Ghost 2-1, Kadena Tower. Current weather is winds variable 40 to 60 knots. Visibility 1/4 mile in heavy rain. Ceiling indefinite. Approach and landing not recommended for single-engine aircraft. Advise your intentions. Jake realized that he was facing a situation that his training had not adequately prepared him to handle. Kadena was reporting weather conditions that were beyond safe landing parameters, but his fuel state meant that alternative options were rapidly disappearing. The storm system was larger than forecast models had predicted, eliminating other diversion airfields that might have provided safer landing conditions. His hands were beginning to shake as the reality of his situation became clear. He was alone in a single-engine aircraft, flying through a major storm system, with insufficient fuel to reach alternate airfields and weather conditions that made landing extremely hazardous even for experienced pilots. The routine patrol mission that had begun 6 hours earlier had evolved into a life-threatening emergency that was testing him beyond his experience level. The radio crackled with a transmission from the USS Constellation's Air Traffic Control Center. Sarah Martinez's calm voice cut through the static and interference. "Ghost 2-1, this is Constellation Approach. We've been monitoring your situation. What is your current fuel state and intentions?" Jake's voice betrayed his growing anxiety. As he responded, "Constellation Approach, Ghost 2-1 has 2,800 pounds of fuel remaining. Kadena is reporting weather below landing minimums. I'm not sure what my options are." Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. "Ghost 2-1, understand your situation. We're going to get you aboard safely. I need you to turn left heading 240 degrees and begin descent to 5,000 feet. We'll talk you through this step by step." As Jake turned toward the carrier's position, he had no idea that he was about to experience the most challenging approach and landing of his career, guided by someone whose reputation for bringing pilots home safely was about to be tested under conditions that neither of them had ever faced before. The storm was still intensifying. The carrier was pitching in seas that were approaching the limits for safe flight operations, and Jake's fuel state meant that there would be no opportunity for a second attempt. Sarah Martinez had been monitoring Jake Townsend's deteriorating situation for the past 20 minutes, and her experienced mind was already calculating solutions that the rookie pilot couldn't see. While Jake was focused on the immediate crisis of flying through severe weather with dwindling fuel, Sarah was conducting a comprehensive analysis of factors that would determine whether he lived or died in the next hour. Her first assessment involved the storm system itself. Weather radar showed Tropical Storm Helena had intensified beyond all forecast predictions, with sustained winds now exceeding 70 knots and embedded thunderstorm cells producing wind shears that could exceed 100 knots in vertical displacement. The storm's movement had also shifted, placing it directly between Jake's current position and the carrier, meaning any approach would require penetrating the most dangerous portion of the weather system. Sarah's meteorological training allowed her to interpret radar data in ways that conventional air traffic controllers might miss. She could identify areas where precipitation cores indicated severe turbulence, recognize wind patterns that suggested dangerous microbursts, and predict how the storm's movement would affect approach conditions over the next 30 minutes. This analysis was crucial because timing Jake's approach to coincide with relatively calmer periods could mean the difference between a successful landing and a catastrophic accident. The carrier's current position presented additional challenges that Sarah had to factor into her calculations. USS Constellation was operating in seas with swells exceeding 20 feet, creating deck motion that would make even routine landings extremely difficult. The ship's engineering department had reported that maintaining course and speed for optimal wind conditions would require operating at the edge of safe parameters for the vessel's structural integrity. Sarah studied the ship's motion characteristics with the analytical mind of someone who understood both naval architecture and aircraft carrier operations. She could predict deck movement patterns based on wave height, vessel speed, and heading relative to the storm's direction. This knowledge would allow her to time Jake's final approach to minimize the effects of deck motion during the critical seconds. When his aircraft would be attempting to catch an arresting wire, her analysis of Jake's aircraft systems revealed both advantages and serious limitations. The FA-18 Super Hornet possessed advanced flight control computers that could compensate for some atmospheric disturbances, but the aircraft's fuel state meant that he would have only one opportunity for a successful landing. His remaining 2,800 pounds of fuel provided approximately 45 minutes of flight time under current conditions, with no margin for missed approaches or extensive maneuvering. Sarah's engineering background allowed her to calculate fuel consumption rates with precision that exceeded the aircraft's onboard systems. She factored in the additional fuel burn associated with flying through turbulence, the power requirements for maintaining airspeed in variable wind conditions, and the fuel needed for the approach and landing sequence. Her calculations indicated that Jake would arrive at the carrier with barely enough fuel for a single approach attempt. The psychological aspect of Jake's situation required equally careful analysis. Sarah had guided dozens of rookie pilots through emergency situations, and she understood the mental processes that separated successful outcomes from disasters. Jake's voice over the radio revealed increasing stress levels that could lead to task saturation and poor decision-making if not managed properly. Her assessment of Jake's training records showed that he had performed well during controlled emergency scenarios, but had never faced a situation where multiple systems failures combined with severe weather and fuel limitations. His carrier qualification grades were above average, but his experience base was limited to ideal weather conditions with instructor pilots, providing guidance and backup. Sarah recognized the signs of a pilot approaching the limits of his experience. Envelope. Jake's radio transmissions were becoming shorter and more clipped, indicating that his workload was increasing to the point where communication was becoming difficult. His flight path was showing minor deviations that suggested he was having trouble maintaining precise navigation while managing multiple emergencies simultaneously. The technical challenges of bringing Jake's aircraft aboard safely required Sarah to consider factors that went beyond conventional air traffic control procedures. Standard carrier approach parameters assumed normal weather conditions, adequate fuel reserves, and pilots with extensive experience. Jake's situation violated all of these assumptions, necessitating an approach strategy that had never been tested. Under operational conditions, Sarah's analysis of historical carrier landing data revealed patterns that could be applied to Jake's unique circumstances. She studied successful recoveries under adverse weather conditions, examining the techniques that had worked and identifying common factors that contributed to positive outcomes. Her research showed that successful emergency approaches typically involved simplified procedures that reduced pilot workload while maintaining safety margins. The carrier's landing signal officers were providing input about deck conditions and visual references that would be available during Jake's approach. Their reports indicated that the optical landing system was functioning normally, but weather conditions would significantly reduce its effectiveness. Visibility was fluctuating between 1 and 3 miles, with frequent periods of heavy precipitation that would obscure the visual cues that pilots relied on for accurate approaches. Sarah's tactical analysis extended beyond the immediate problem of getting Jake aboard safely. She was coordinating with multiple departments throughout the ship to optimize conditions for his recovery attempt. The navigation team was adjusting course and speed to provide the best possible wind conditions over the deck. The engineering department was monitoring power plant performance to ensure that the ship could maintain optimal positioning despite heavy seas. Her communication with the ship's medical department ensured that trauma teams would be standing by in case Jake's landing attempt resulted in injuries. Flight deck crews were being briefed on emergency procedures for extracting pilots from damaged aircraft. Fire suppression systems were being tested and positioned for immediate response to any post-landing emergencies. The complexity of coordinating all these elements while simultaneously providing guidance to an increasingly stressed pilot demonstrated why Sarah's position required such extensive training and experience. She was managing a three-dimensional chess game where every decision affected multiple variables, and where the consequences of miscalculation would be measured in human lives. Sarah's analysis of Jake's emotional state revealed the need for a communication strategy that would maintain his confidence while providing the detailed guidance he needed to survive the next hour. Her experience with rookie pilots had taught her that excessive technical information could increase stress levels, while overly simplified instructions might not provide sufficient detail for complex procedures. She decided to adopt a coaching approach that combined her authority as an experienced controller with the mentoring techniques she had learned during her own flying career. Her goal was to project absolute confidence in Jake's abilities while providing step-by-step guidance that would reduce his decision-making burden during the most critical phases of the approach. The weather analysis data streaming into Sarah's console showed that conditions were continuing to deteriorate around the carrier's position. Helena's eye wall was approaching, bringing with it winds that would exceed the safe operating limits for carrier aviation. Sarah calculated that Jake would need to begin his approach within the next 20 minutes to avoid encountering the worst conditions the storm had to offer. Her study of alternative recovery options confirmed that the carrier landing was Jake's only viable choice for survival. All diversion airfields within his fuel range were reporting weather conditions that were either below landing minimums or approaching dangerous levels. Military airfields throughout the region were implementing storm preparation procedures that would close their runways within the next hour. Sarah's analysis of Jake's navigation capabilities revealed another challenge that would need to be addressed. His aircraft's radar was functioning normally, but the severe weather was creating returns that could confuse inexperienced pilots. She would need to provide precise heading and altitude instructions that would guide him through the safest portions of the storm system while maintaining his approach path to the carrier. The technical specifications of the Super Hornet's approach systems gave Sarah confidence that the aircraft possessed the capabilities needed for a successful landing under these conditions. The aircraft's automatic carrier landing system could provide guidance during the final approach phase, but its effectiveness would be reduced by the severe weather and deck motion. Jake would need to rely primarily on manual flying skills that he had only recently developed. Sarah's comprehensive analysis led her to conclude that Jake's survival depended on executing a modified approach procedure that had never been attempted under operational conditions. The technique would require precise timing, flawless communication, and flying skills that pushed a rookie pilot to his absolute limits. But her calculations indicated that it was his only chance for successful recovery. As she prepared to begin the most challenging air traffic control sequence of her career, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had carried her through hundreds of emergency situations. Her analysis was complete, her strategy was formed, and her confidence in Jake's abilities was stronger than his own confidence in himself. Over the next hour, she would discover whether 12 years of experience had prepared her for a situation that defied every standard procedure in naval aviation. The storm was intensifying around them. Jake's fuel was decreasing by the minute, and the carrier was struggling to maintain operational capability in seas that were approaching the limits of safe operations. But Sarah Martinez had never failed to bring a pilot home, and she was not about to start with a rookie who was depending entirely on her expertise to survive the most dangerous flight of his young career. Ghost 2-1, I need you to listen carefully to everything I'm about to tell you. Sarah's voice cut through the storm static with absolute authority. We're going to modify standard approach procedures to account for current conditions. This technique isn't in any manual you've studied, but it's going to save your life. Jake's response revealed his growing desperation as turbulence continued battering his aircraft. Phoenix, I've never done a carrier landing in conditions like this. My training was all in clear weather with instructor pilots. I don't know if I can handle this alone." Sarah recognized the moment when rookie pilots either broke under pressure or discovered reserves of capability they didn't know they possessed. Her next words would determine which path Jake would follow. Ghost 2-1. You have 847 hours of total flight time and 23 carrier landings in your logbook. That represents more training than most military pilots receive in their entire careers. You have the skills needed for this approach. I'm going to guide you through every step. The first phase of Sarah's preparation strategy involved reconfiguring Jake's mental approach to the landing. Instead of viewing it as an emergency situation beyond his capabilities, she needed him to understand it as a technical challenge that could be solved through methodical execution of modified procedures. "Jake, I want you to forget everything. You've heard about this being a dangerous situation," Sarah continued, using his first name to establish personal connection. "We're going to break this approach into individual components that you've practiced hundreds of times. Each element is within your skill set. The only difference is the sequence and timing." Sarah began by walking Jake through fuel management calculations that would optimize his remaining flight time. "Your current fuel state gives us exactly 38 minutes of flight time under these turbulence conditions. I'm going to vector you through the calmest portions of the storm system, which will reduce your fuel burn by approximately 200 pounds compared to a direct approach." Her guidance incorporated meteorological knowledge that Jake's training hadn't covered. The storm has a spiral structure with bands of severe weather separated by relatively calm areas. I'm tracking these bands on weather radar, and I can time your approach to coincide with a window of reduced turbulence that will open in exactly 22 minutes. Jake's aircraft was equipped with a fuel quantity indicator that displayed remaining fuel in real time, but Sarah's calculations went beyond simple quantity measurements. She was factoring in fuel density variations due to temperature changes, consumption rates during different phases of flight, and the additional fuel requirements for flying in turbulent conditions. Ghost 2-1, reduce your airspeed to 280 knots and maintain current altitude. This power setting will give you maximum fuel efficiency while keeping you within the aircraft's optimal performance envelope for storm penetration. Sarah's instructions were based on Super Hornet performance data that she had memorized during years of guiding similar aircraft through emergency situations. The preparation phase required Sarah to coordinate resources throughout the ship that would support Jake's recovery attempt. Her communications with the carrier's Combat Information Center ensured that all tracking radars were focused on providing the most accurate possible information about Jake's position relative to the ship and the storm system. "Bridge, this is Phoenix in Air Ops. I need you to maintain the current course and speed for the next 25 minutes. Then execute a starboard turn to heading 095 to optimize wind conditions for recovery. Time this maneuver to coincide with my final approach vector for Ghost 2-1. The ship's navigation team acknowledged Sarah's request while providing information about sea conditions that would affect the timing of Jake's approach. Phoenix, the current sea state, is running 18 to 22-foot swells from the southwest. Deck motion is cycling every 45 seconds with maximum pitch variations of plus or minus 6 degrees. Sarah incorporated this information into her approach planning, recognizing that Jake's landing attempt would need to be timed to coincide with the most stable portion of the ship's motion cycle. Ghost 2-1, when we begin final approach, I'll call out deck motion timing so you can anticipate pitch and roll variations during your final 30 seconds. Her preparation strategy extended to the ship's landing signal officers, who would provide visual backup guidance during Jake's approach. LSO, we're going to use modified ball call procedures for this recovery. Standard radio calls may be too complex for a rookie pilot managing multiple emergencies simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Paddles Wilson, the senior landing signal officer, had worked with Sarah on dozens of challenging recoveries. Phoenix understood. We'll use simplified calls focusing only on glide slope and lineup corrections. Weather is reducing our visual capability, but the optical landing system is still functional. Sarah's coordination with the flight deck crew involved positioning emergency equipment for immediate response if Jake's landing resulted in aircraft damage or pilot injury. Flight deck, position crash crews at both ends of the landing area. Have fire suppression equipment ready for immediate deployment, but keep personnel clear of the approach path until the aircraft is safely aboard. The technical preparation for Jake's approach required Sarah to program navigation solutions into the carrier's approach radar systems. She calculated multiple approach vectors that would bring Jake to the ship through the safest portions of the storm system, with backup routes available if weather conditions shifted during his inbound flight. Ghost 2-1, I'm uploading approach waypoints to your navigation system. These routes have been optimized to avoid the most severe turbulence based on current weather radar data. Follow these waypoints precisely and don't deviate without my explicit clearance. Jake's acknowledgement revealed that his stress levels were stabilizing as Sarah's methodical preparation gave him specific tasks to focus on rather than the overwhelming magnitude of his situation. Phoenix, I have the waypoints loaded. My navigation system shows the first turn point in 12 minutes at waypoint Alpha. Sarah's preparation included detailed briefings about the modified approach procedures that Jake would need to execute. Standard carrier approaches assume normal weather conditions and adequate fuel reserves. We're going to use a technique called a straight-in approach that eliminates the usual overhead pattern and gets you aboard with minimum fuel expenditure. The straight-in approach technique required precise navigation and airspeed control that would test Jake's flying skills under conditions far more challenging than those he had experienced during training. This approach will bring you directly to the carrier without the normal pattern work. You'll intercept the glide slope 8 miles from the ship and fly a continuous descent to touchdown. Her explanation of the modified procedures included technical details that helped Jake understand the aerodynamic principles involved. The straight-in approach reduces your exposure to turbulence and minimizes fuel consumption, but it requires precise airspeed control throughout the descent. Any deviation from target speeds will affect your touchdown point and could result in missing the arresting cables. Sarah's preparation strategy included contingency planning for multiple scenarios that could develop during Jake's approach. If weather conditions deteriorate during your final approach, I have alternate vectors programmed that will take you around the worst turbulence. If your aircraft systems malfunction, I have emergency approach procedures that will still get you aboard safely. The psychological preparation component involved Sarah's careful management of Jake's confidence levels while ensuring he understood the seriousness of his situation. Jake, I need you to understand that this approach will be more challenging than anything you've done before. But it's also completely within your capabilities if you follow my guidance precisely. Her experience with rookie pilots had taught her to balance honesty about dangers with confidence in their abilities. The storm is severe, fuel is limited, and deck conditions are rough. But I've guided pilots through worse situations, and you have the training needed to execute this approach successfully. Trust your instruments, trust your training, and trust my guidance. Sarah's final preparation involved testing all communication systems to ensure that radio contact would remain clear during the critical phases of Jake's approach. Static interference from the storm was affecting some frequencies, but backup communication channels were available if primary systems failed. Ghost 2-1, we're going to use frequency 127.15 for approach control. This frequency has the best signal strength through the storm system. If we lose contact on this frequency, Immediately switch to emergency frequency 121.5 and continue following your last instructions. The ship's engineering department reported that all systems required for aircraft recovery were functioning normally despite the severe weather. Steam catapults were charged and ready for immediate launch of search and rescue helicopters if needed. Arresting gear was tested and configured for the weight and approach speed of Jake's Super Hornet. As the final minutes of preparation concluded, Sarah felt the familiar combination of confidence and concern that preceded every challenging recovery operation. Her analysis was complete, resources were positioned, procedures were briefed, and Jake's aircraft was beginning the approach that would test everything both of them had learned during their aviation careers. Ghost 2-1, you are cleared to begin approach. Turn left heading 240 degrees, descend to 3,000 feet, and reduce airspeed to 250 knots. We're starting the approach that's going to bring you home safely. Sarah's voice carried absolute conviction that masked her awareness that the next 30 minutes would determine whether her preparation had been sufficient to save the life of a rookie pilot who was depending entirely on her expertise to survive. Ghost 2-1, you are now 15 miles from the ship. Begin descent to 1,200 feet and reduce airspeed to 140 knots. Configure your aircraft for landing gear down, flaps full, hook down. Sarah's instructions came with machine-like precision as Jake entered the most dangerous phase of his young flying career. Jake's hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, but his voice betrayed mounting tension as turbulence increased dramatically. Phoenix, I'm getting severe buffeting during gear extension. The aircraft is becoming difficult to control at these power settings. That's normal for these conditions. Jake, the Super Hornet's flight control computers are compensating automatically. Trust the aircraft systems and focus on maintaining your target airspeed. Any deviation from 140 knots will affect your touchdown point. The approach Sarah had designed required Jake to fly through the eye wall of Tropical Storm Helena, using the brief calm in the storm center to line up with the carrier before encountering the turbulence on the opposite side. Weather radar showed this window would last exactly 4 minutes, barely enough time for a perfect approach with no margin for error. Ghost 2-1, you're entering the storm's outer band now. Expect severe turbulence for the next 90 seconds. Then conditions will improve dramatically as you reach the eye wall. Maintain current heading and altitude. Do not attempt to deviate around the turbulence. Jake's aircraft was being thrown around by wind shears that exceeded anything he had experienced during training. His altitude varied by 200 feet within seconds. Airspeed fluctuated wildly, and the horizon disappeared completely in sheets of rain that overwhelmed his windscreen. Only his instrument training kept him oriented as visual references vanished. Phoenix, I can't see anything outside the cockpit. My altitude is all over the place, and I'm having trouble maintaining heading. This turbulence is beyond anything I've ever experienced. Sarah's response demonstrated the calm authority that had made her legendary throughout the fleet. Jake, your instruments are accurate, and your aircraft is performing normally. The turbulence you're experiencing is severe, but temporary. In 45 seconds, you'll break into calm air and visual conditions will improve dramatically. Her prediction proved accurate as Jake's Super Hornet suddenly emerged from the chaotic turbulence into the eerily calm center of the storm. The eye wall created a circular area of relatively stable air, where visibility improved to several miles and wind speeds dropped to manageable levels. For the first time in over an hour, Jake could see the ocean surface below him. Phoenix, I'm in calm air now. I can see the carrier at my 12 o'clock position, approximately 8 miles. The deck looks like it's moving significantly in the swells. Perfect. Jake, you're right on course and at the correct altitude. The ship is experiencing heavy seas, but our landing signal officers are tracking deck motion and will provide timing calls for your touchdown. Begin final approach descent, target altitude 600 feet at 4 miles from the ship. The straight-in approach eliminated the complex maneuvering that normally preceded carrier landings, but it required precise flying that challenged Jake's limited experience. His descent rate had to be controlled within narrow parameters to intercept the optical landing system's glide slope at exactly the right point. Too high or too low, and he would either miss the arresting cables or crash into the carrier's stern. The Ghost 2-1, you are on course and on glide path. Reduce power slightly to maintain 140 knots. Your fuel state shows 800 pounds remaining, enough for this approach with no reserves for a second attempt. Jake's acknowledgement revealed his awareness of the no-go-around situation he was facing. Phoenix, understood. One shot to get this right. I can see the optical landing system now. The meatball appears to be centered. The optical landing system, known universally as the meatball, provided visual guidance for pilots during the final approach phase. The amber light in the center of the Fresnel lens array indicated that Jake was on the correct glide slope, but maintaining this position required constant power and altitude adjustments as atmospheric conditions changed. Excellent, Jake. Hold. That meatball centered and maintain current airspeed. You're flying this approach perfectly. At 2 miles, expect to encounter the backside of the storm system, but conditions won't be as severe as what you experienced earlier. Sarah's coordination with the landing signal officers ensured that Jake would receive backup guidance during the final 30 seconds of his approach. Lieutenant Commander Wilson was positioned on the carrier's port side with direct radio communication to provide immediate corrections if Jake's approach parameters deviated from safe limits. LSO has visual contact with your aircraft, Sarah reported. Paddles is calling you on glide slope, on centerline, looking good for approach. Continue current. Approach angle and power setting. As predicted, Jake's aircraft encountered the storm's trailing edge at 2 miles from the carrier, but the turbulence was significantly less severe than the front wall he had penetrated earlier. His aircraft bounced and rolled in the unstable air, but the Super Hornet's advanced flight control systems maintained controllability that would have been impossible in earlier generation aircraft. Phoenix, I'm getting buffeted again, but it's manageable. The deck is getting larger quickly. I can see crew members on the flight deck wearing colored jerseys. That's normal perspective for carrier approach, Jake. Your closure rate with the ship is 140 knots, so the deck will appear to grow very rapidly during the final mile. Trust your altitude and airspeed instruments. They're more accurate than visual references at this point. The final mile of Jake's approach required him to maintain precise control inputs while the carrier's deck motion created a moving target. That challenged even experienced pilots. The ship was pitching in 20-foot swells with a cycle time that the landing signal officers had calculated to provide optimal touchdown conditions if Jake's timing remained perfect. Ghost 2-1, LSO is calling you a little high on glide slope. Reduce power slightly and allow the aircraft to settle back onto the correct approach path. Small power corrections only don't over-control the aircraft. Jake's power reduction brought his aircraft back onto the optimal glide slope, just as the carrier's deck began its upward motion in the wave cycle. The timing was critical because touchdown needed to occur as the deck reached its highest point to minimize the impact forces that could damage the aircraft or injure the pilot. Perfect correction, Jake. You're back on glide slope and looking good. The deck is coming up to meet you in approximately 15 seconds. Keep your current approach angle and prepare for touchdown. The final seconds of Jake's approach seemed to stretch endlessly as his Super Hornet descended toward the carrier's angled deck. The optical landing system's meatball remained centered, indicating that his glide slope was correct. His airspeed held steady at 140 knots. The carrier's deck filled his windscreen as the moment of truth approached. LSO is calling you on speed. On glide slope, looking good, Sarah transmitted. You're going to touch down in 5 seconds. Keep flying the aircraft all the way to touchdown. Don't try to flare or change anything. Jake's aircraft crossed the carrier's stern with less than 10 feet of clearance, exactly as designed for a proper carrier approach. His main landing gear contacted the steel deck with tremendous force, designed to ensure positive engagement with. One of the 4 arresting cables stretched across the landing area. The sudden deceleration from 140 knots to 0 in less than 300 feet created G-forces that pressed Jake deep into his ejection seat. Touchdown, hook engaged, full stop. The landing signal officer's triumphant call confirmed that Jake had successfully caught an arresting cable and was safely aboard the carrier. Sarah's voice carried quiet satisfaction as she completed the recovery sequence. Ghost 2-1, welcome aboard USS Constellation. Taxi clear of the landing area and shut down engines. Outstanding approach and landing under extremely challenging conditions. But the successful touchdown was only the beginning of Jake's aircraft recovery. Flight deck crews immediately surrounded his Super Hornet to secure the aircraft and ensure that no damage had occurred during the violent landing. Fuel quantity checks showed that Jake had landed with less than 400 pounds of fuel remaining, approximately 8 minutes of flight time under current conditions. The post-landing checklist required Jake to maintain engine power until the aircraft was properly positioned and secured to the deck. His hands were shaking from adrenaline as the reality of what he had just accomplished began to sink in. He had successfully completed a carrier landing in weather conditions that challenged even veteran pilots. "Phoenix, I can't believe we just did that," Jake transmitted while following flight deck director signals to position his aircraft. "That was the most intense flying I've ever done. Thank you for getting me through it." Sarah's response reflected the professional satisfaction that came with successfully completing a challenging recovery operation. "Jake, that was exceptional flying under extremely difficult conditions. You maintained composure, followed instructions precisely, and executed a perfect approach and landing. That performance would have impressed pilots 10 times your experience." The flight deck crew's inspection of Jake's aircraft revealed no damage from the turbulent flight or hard landing. Super Hornets were designed to withstand the structural stresses of carrier operations, including approaches and landings under adverse weather conditions. The aircraft was fully mission-capable and ready for normal operations once weather conditions improved. As Jake completed his post-flight procedures and prepared to exit his aircraft, he reflected on the experience that had transformed him from a rookie pilot into someone who had successfully handled one of the most challenging situations in naval aviation. His confidence level had increased dramatically during the hour-long ordeal that had tested every skill he possessed. The storm was beginning to move away from the carrier's position, with weather conditions gradually improving as Helena continued its track toward the northwest. Within 6 hours, normal flight operations would resume, but Jake's emergency approach and landing had demonstrated capabilities that would influence his career for years to come. Sarah's successful guidance of Jake through the emergency approach represented another example of her exceptional abilities as an air traffic controller. Her analysis, preparation, and execution had combined to save the life of a pilot who might not have survived without her expertise. The technique she had developed during 12 years of naval aviation continued to evolve with each challenging situation she encountered. As Jake climbed down from his aircraft and stepped onto the carrier's deck for the first time in over 7 hours, he understood that he had just experienced something that would define his perspective on naval aviation for the rest of his career. The rookie pilot who had panicked at Mach 2 had become someone who could handle emergency situations with the confidence of a veteran aviator. Within minutes of Jake's successful landing, word of the extraordinary recovery operation was spreading throughout USS Constellation's 5,000-person crew. The ship's communication systems buzzed with details of how a rookie pilot had been guided through impossible weather conditions by an air traffic controller, whose reputation for bringing aviators home safely had just reached legendary status. Captain Michael "Hammer" Rodriguez, the ship's commanding officer, arrived on the flight deck as Jake was completing his post-flight inspection. At 52 years old, Rodriguez had commanded aircraft carriers for 4 years and had witnessed countless carrier landings under challenging conditions, but Jake's approach had impressed him beyond anything in his experience. "Lieutenant Thompson, I've been monitoring your recovery from the bridge," Captain Rodriguez said as Jake removed his helmet and flight gear. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed under emergency conditions. Your approach and landing would have challenged pilots with 20 years of carrier experience." Jake's response reflected both exhaustion and amazement at what he had accomplished. "Sir, I couldn't have done it without Commander Martinez's guidance. She talked me through every step of the approach and made decisions that saved my life. I've never experienced anything like that level of professional support." The flight deck crew's debriefing revealed technical details that emphasized the exceptional nature of Jake's landing. His aircraft had touched down within 20 feet of the optimal touchdown point, despite weather conditions that had reduced visibility to less than half a mile during critical phases of the approach. The precision required for such accuracy exceeded normal expectations for even veteran pilots. Senior Chief Aviation Bosun's Mate Tony "Chains" Williams, who had supervised flight deck operations for 15 years, provided his assessment of the landing to Captain Rodriguez. "Skipper, I've seen thousands of carrier landings in weather conditions ranging from perfect to marginal. This recovery was executed under conditions that we would normally consider beyond safe operating parameters. The aircraft's fuel quantity measurement confirmed how narrow Jake's margin for error had been throughout the emergency approach. Post-landing fuel checks showed 347 pounds, remaining less than 7 minutes of flight time under the turbulent conditions he had experienced. A single missed approach would have resulted in fuel exhaustion before a second attempt could be completed. Commander Sarah Martinez's performance during the crisis had demonstrated air traffic control capabilities that established new standards for emergency recovery operations. Her coordination of weather analysis, ship positioning, crew preparation, and pilot guidance had created a systematic response that turned a potentially fatal situation into a textbook example of professional aviation expertise. Admiral Patricia "Sledgehammer" Harrison, commander of Carrier Strike Group 7, received detailed briefings about Jake's recovery operation within 2 hours of his landing. From her flagship position aboard USS Princeton, she monitored the situation's development and authorized commendations for both Jake and Sarah that would recognize their extraordinary performance under emergency conditions. This recovery operation demonstrates the highest levels of professional competence that our naval aviation community can achieve, Admiral Harrison announced during a secure video conference with the carrier's senior staff. Lieutenant Thompson's flying skills and Commander Martinez's air traffic control expertise combined to produce an outcome that saved lives and preserved valuable military assets. The technical analysis of Jake's approach revealed innovations in emergency recovery procedures that would influence naval aviation training throughout the fleet. Sarah's use of modified approach vectors, simplified communication protocols, and coordinated ship positioning had created techniques that could be applied to future emergency situations. Lieutenant Commander Davis, who had successfully landed at Kadena Air Base despite his electrical failures, received updates about Jake's recovery operation through military communication channels. His assessment of the situation provided additional perspective from an experienced pilot who understood the challenges Jake had faced. "That kid flew through conditions that would have tested any pilot in the fleet," Davis commented during his debriefing at Kadena. Commander Martinez's guidance turned what should have been a fatal situation into a successful recovery. The techniques they developed could revolutionize how we handle emergency approaches in severe weather. The storm tracking data showed that Tropical Storm Helena continued intensifying after Jake's landing, eventually reaching Category 2 hurricane strength with sustained winds exceeding 100 knots. Weather analysis confirmed that Jake's approach had been executed during the only window of opportunity that would have allowed successful recovery, before conditions became completely UNSURVIVABL. Flight operations throughout the Western Pacific had been suspended due to Helena's intensity, making USS Constellation one of the few platforms capable of conducting aircraft recovery operations. Military airfields within 500 miles had implemented storm preparation procedures that closed their runways, leaving the carrier as Jake's only viable option for survival. The ship's medical department conducted comprehensive examinations of both Jake and Sarah to assess the physical and psychological effects of the high-stress emergency operation. Flight surgeons found that both individuals had performed at peak effectiveness, despite physiological stress levels that would have degraded performance in less experienced personnel. Lieutenant Thompson's vital signs during the approach showed stress indicators consistent with extreme emergency conditions, reported Lieutenant Commander Michelle "Doc" Foster, the ship's senior flight surgeon. However, his performance degradation was minimal, indicating exceptional training and natural ability under pressure. Sarah's medical evaluation revealed similar findings, with stress indicators that remained within acceptable ranges throughout the crisis despite her responsibility for coordinating the complex recovery operation. Commander Martinez maintained optimal cognitive function while managing multiple emergency variables simultaneously, Dr. Foster noted. Her performance represents the highest level of professional competence under extreme stress. The carrier's intelligence department analyzed weather data and flight tracking information to document the precise conditions under which the recovery operation had been executed. Their findings would contribute to weather operations research and emergency procedure development that would benefit naval aviation for years to come. Communication intercepts revealed that foreign military forces monitoring the area had observed Jake's recovery operation with professional interest. International aviation communities recognized that the techniques demonstrated during his approach represented advances in emergency recovery capabilities that exceeded previously known standards. American naval aviation has demonstrated technological and procedural capabilities that surpass our current understanding of carrier operations in severe weather, noted one intercepted communication from a foreign naval intelligence service. Their ability to recover aircraft under these conditions indicates training and equipment advantages that we had not previously recognized. The successful completion of Jake's recovery operation had broader implications for Carrier Strike Group operations throughout the region. USS Constellation's demonstrated ability to maintain flight operations under extreme weather conditions enhanced the battle group's operational flexibility and deterrent capabilities. Captain Rodriguez's report to Fleet Command emphasized the strategic significance of the recovery operation beyond its immediate success in saving lives and preserving equipment. This operation has demonstrated our ability to maintain air operations under conditions that would ground most military aviation units worldwide, he reported. The tactical advantages this capability provides are significant for future operations in contested environments. The precision timing of Jake's approach had required coordination between multiple ship departments that functioned with unprecedented efficiency during the emergency. Navigation, engineering, meteorology, and flight operations had combined their expertise to create optimal conditions for the recovery attempt. Despite severe environmental challenges, the ship's engineering department reported that maintaining optimal course and speed for Jake's approach had pushed the vessel's systems to their operational limits in heavy seas. We operated at maximum sustainable power while maintaining precise heading and speed despite wave heights. exceeding design parameters, reported Commander James Diesel Murphy, the ship's chief engineer. Radar tracking data showed that Jake's approach had been flown with navigational precision that exceeded normal expectations for instrument flight in severe weather. His adherence to Sarah's vectoring instructions had kept him within optimal approach corridors despite atmospheric conditions that created significant navigational challenges. The flight deck crew's performance during Jake's recovery demonstrated professionalism that matched the exceptional flying and air traffic control that had made the operation possible. Their preparation of emergency equipment and immediate response to secure the aircraft after landing showed the coordinated teamwork that made carrier operations successful under any conditions. As news of the successful recovery operation spread throughout the Pacific Fleet, it became a case study in emergency aviation procedures that would be analyzed and incorporated into training programs at naval aviation schools worldwide. The combination of pilot skill, air traffic control expertise, and ship coordination had created a template for handling similar emergencies. The weather briefing for the following day showed that Tropical Storm Helena was moving away from the carrier's operating area, with normal flight operations expected to resume within 12 hours. The storm's passage left clear skies and calm seas that provided a stark contrast to the conditions under which Jake's dramatic approach had been executed. Jake's transformation from a panicked rookie pilot to someone who had successfully completed one of the most challenging carrier landings in naval aviation history represented a personal achievement that would influence his career trajectory for decades. His confidence in handling emergency situations had increased exponentially through the experience of surviving conditions that would have intimidated far more experienced aviators. Sarah's guidance throughout the emergency had demonstrated air traffic control capabilities that established her as one of the most skilled emergency recovery specialists in naval aviation. Her techniques would be studied and taught to future generations of controllers who would face similar challenges in their careers. 2 years after that storm-tossed night in the Western Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Jake "Maverick" Thompson stood before a classroom of rookie naval aviators at the Naval Air Training Command in Pensacola, Florida. His promotion to department head had come ahead of schedule, recognition of exceptional performance that had begun with his emergency carrier landing under impossible conditions. The PowerPoint slide behind him displayed a photograph of USS Constellation's flight deck taken during Tropical Storm Helena, waves crashing over the bow while flight operations continued. Who can tell me why maintaining carrier qualifications in severe weather is critical to naval aviation readiness? Jake asked his students, his voice carrying the authority that came from surviving situations that tested the absolute limits of human and machine capability. Lieutenant Amy Venva Chun raised her hand, her flight suit bearing the wings of gold. That marked her as one of the Navy's newest pilots. Sir, because combat operations don't pause for bad weather. Enemy forces might choose to attack during storms, assuming we can't launch or recover aircraft. Exactly right, Lieutenant Chen, Jake replied, advancing to the next slide that showed weather radar images from the night of his emergency approach. But there's another reason that's equally important. Training in extreme conditions develops judgment and skills that make routine operations seem manageable by comparison. The training program Jake had developed incorporated lessons learned from his own experience with emergency procedures under stress. His curriculum emphasized decision-making under pressure, resource management during crisis situations, and the importance of communication between aircrew and ship-based controllers during challenging operations. At the same time, 8,000 miles away aboard USS Gerald R. Ford, operating in the Mediterranean Sea, Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez was concluding her final day as an aircraft carrier air operations officer. Her promotion to captain had been accompanied by assignment as commanding officer of Naval Air Station Oceana, where she would oversee training for East Coast carrier aviation squadrons, Sarah's farewell address to the Ford's crew reflected on 14 years of naval aviation that had culminated in the development of emergency recovery procedures now taught throughout the fleet. Every pilot who launches from a carrier deck carries with them the collective knowledge and experience of everyone who came before them, she told the assembled Air Department personnel. The techniques we've developed and the lessons we've learned will continue protecting lives long after we've moved on to other assignments. The emergency approach procedures that Sarah had pioneered during Jake's recovery had been codified into official naval aviation doctrine. The Martinez method, as it had become known throughout the fleet, was now taught to air traffic controllers worldwide as a systematic approach to managing single-engine emergency recoveries in severe weather conditions. Naval Air Systems Command had incorporated technical specifications from Jake's emergency landing into design requirements for next-generation carrier aircraft. His Super Hornets performance data during the storm approach provided engineering teams with real-world stress testing that influenced structural requirements and flight control system programming for future aircraft. The United States Naval Academy's leadership curriculum now included case study analysis of the emergency recovery operation, focusing on decision-making under extreme pressure and the importance of trust between team members during crisis situations. Midshipmen studied transcripts of radio communications between Jake and Sarah to understand how professional competence and calm communication could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. International military aviation communities had requested detailed briefings about the recovery techniques demonstrated during Jake's approach. NATO Naval Aviation Commands incorporated the Martinez method into their own emergency procedures, recognizing that the innovations developed during that stormy night represented advances in aviation safety that transcended national boundaries. Weather Service's National Hurricane Center modified storm tracking procedures based on meteorological analysis from Helena's development and intensification. Sarah's successful prediction of calm conditions within the storm's eye had demonstrated weather pattern recognition that improved forecasting accuracy for future tropical cyclones. Commercial aviation adopted modified versions of the communication protocols that Sarah had used during Jake's approach. Airlines worldwide implemented simplified emergency communication procedures that reduced pilot workload during high-stress situations, techniques that had been proven effective under the most demanding conditions naval aviation could present. Jake's current assignment involved developing training scenarios that recreated the psychological and technical challenges of emergency approaches without exposing student pilots to actual danger. Flight simulators now incorporated weather models and equipment failures that challenged pilots with realistic emergency conditions based on actual operational experience. The most important lesson from emergency situations is that panic kills, Jake explained to his students while reviewing simulator training results. Technical knowledge and procedural training will carry you through situations that seem impossible if you maintain composure and trust the guidance of experienced personnel. His teaching methods emphasized the importance of communication skills that allowed aircrew to work effectively with ship-based controllers during emergency situations. Commander Martinez saved my life not just through her technical expertise, but through her ability to communicate complex procedures in terms I could understand and execute under extreme stress. Sarah's new command at Naval Air Station Oceana placed her in charge of training the Navy's most experienced pilots for deployment aboard aircraft carriers worldwide. Her curriculum development focused on building the type of calm professionalism that had characterized her own performance during emergency situations. Excellence in naval aviation requires more than individual skill, Sarah told newly reported pilots during orientation briefings. It requires the ability to function as part of a team where every member's expertise contributes to mission success and survival during challenging operations. The Advanced Simulator Complex at Oceana incorporated weather modeling and emergency scenarios based directly on conditions that Jake and Sarah had faced during their real-world crisis. Student pilots experienced realistic training that prepared them for situations that previous generations of aviators had learned through dangerous trial-and-error processes. Research data from Jake's emergency approach had contributed to development of improved carrier landing systems that provided enhanced guidance during low-visibility approaches. Optical landing systems now incorporated weather compensation algorithms that maintained accuracy despite rain, spray, and atmospheric disturbances that had previously degraded performance. The Naval Safety Center's analysis of the emergency recovery operation identified factors that could be applied to preventing similar crises in the future. Weather briefing procedures now included enhanced storm development monitoring and alternative planning that reduced the likelihood of aircraft being caught in rapidly deteriorating conditions. Flight training programs worldwide modified their curricula to include elements of the mental preparation techniques that had enabled Jake to maintain effectiveness despite physiological stress that exceeded normal human performance parameters. Sports psychology principles were adapted for aviation training, helping pilots develop resilience that translated into better performance under pressure. The technical innovations demonstrated during Jake's approach influenced development of unmanned aircraft systems designed for carrier operations. Engineering teams incorporated lessons learned from human pilot performance under extreme conditions into automated systems that could potentially handle similar emergencies without risking human lives. International maritime law now recognized the precedent established by USS Constellation's ability to maintain flight operations under extreme weather conditions. Carrier strike groups operating in international waters had demonstrated capabilities that influenced diplomatic and military planning considerations worldwide. The professional relationship between Jake and Sarah had evolved into a mentoring partnership that continued influencing their respective careers and the careers of personnel they trained. Their collaboration demonstrated how expertise and trust could overcome challenges that exceeded individual capabilities. Military leadership schools studied the command decisions made during the emergency recovery operation, analyzing how Captain Rodriguez's authorization of extreme weather flight operations had balanced risk against the necessity of saving human life. The case became a model for decision-making under conditions where all available options carried significant dangers. Jake's current students represented the next generation of naval aviators who would face challenges that their predecessors could not have imagined. Climate change was creating more severe weather patterns that would test carrier operations under increasingly demanding conditions. "The storm that nearly killed me was a Category 2 hurricane," Jake explained during advanced weather flying instruction. "Current climate models predict that we'll routinely encounter Category 4 and 5 systems in our operating areas. The techniques we've developed may seem extreme today, but they'll be routine procedures for your generation." Sarah's research into artificial intelligence applications for air traffic control focused on incorporating human judgment into automated systems that could potentially provide guidance during emergencies when human controllers were unavailable. Her goal was creating technology that could replicate the intuitive decision-making that had saved Jake's life. The memorial established at Naval Air Station Pensacola honored naval aviators who had died in training and operational accidents, but it also celebrated innovations that had prevented fatalities through improved procedures and equipment. Jake and Sarah's emergency recovery was featured as an example of how professional expertise could transform potential tragedies into opportunities for advancement. Veterans of naval aviation often gathered to discuss legendary flights and memorable recoveries that had become part of fleet folklore. Jake's storm approach had joined the ranks of famous aviation achievements that inspired current and future generations of military pilots. The technological advances that had enabled Jake's successful recovery continued evolving, with each improvement building upon lessons learned from previous emergency situations. Modern carrier aircraft possessed enhanced capabilities that made similar emergencies more survivable, but the human factors remained constant. Technology will continue improving, Sarah observed during a recent symposium on emergency aviation. Procedures, but the fundamental principles of airmanship, communication, and teamwork remain unchanged. Those qualities will always determine survival during crisis situations. The story of Jake's emergency landing had become more than a tale of individual heroism or professional competence. It represented the pinnacle of what could be achieved when training, technology, and human expertise combined under the most challenging conditions military aviation could present. Today, every naval aviator who launches from a carrier deck carries with them the knowledge that no situation is hopeless if they maintain professionalism and trust the expertise of their teammates. The rookie pilot who once panicked at Mach 2 had become proof that even the most desperate circumstances can be overcome through preparation, skill, and the unwavering commitment to bring everyone home safely. 5 years had passed since that unforgettable night when Lieutenant Jake Thompson first heard Commander Sarah Martinez's voice cutting through the storm static with words that would save his life. Now Captain Jake Maverick Thompson stood on the bridge wing of USS Enterprise, watching his own student pilots practice carrier approaches in conditions that would have seemed routine compared to what he had survived half a decade earlier. The morning sun reflected off calm Pacific waters as Lieutenant Sarah Ace Williams lined up for her first solo carrier landing after completing advanced flight training under Jake's instruction. Her call sign wasn't coincidental. She had specifically requested an assignment to Jake's training squadron after studying his legendary emergency recovery during her time at the Naval Academy. Ghost Rider 207, you are cleared for approach, came the familiar voice from the Air Traffic Control Center. But this time, it wasn't Sarah Martinez providing guidance. Commander Rebecca Lighthouse Foster had learned her craft from studying the Martinez method, and her calm professionalism carried echoes of the legendary controller who had revolutionized emergency aviation procedures. Jake monitored the approach frequencies while observing Lieutenant Williams's technique through high-powered binoculars. Her aircraft handling showed the precision that came from training in simulators, programmed with weather conditions based on his own emergency approach. Every student pilot now learned to fly in virtual storms that replicated the exact atmospheric conditions he had survived. Her approach angle looks perfect, sir, observed Lieutenant Commander Marcus Steady Rodriguez, Jake's current executive officer. The new optical landing system upgrades make these approaches much more precise than the equipment available during your emergency recovery. Jake nodded while continuing to track Williams's approach progress. The technological advances developed since his storm landing had indeed made carrier aviation significantly safer, but he knew that no amount of equipment could replace the human judgment and communication skills that had saved his life. Technology helps, but it's still the pilot and controller working together that determines success. Lieutenant Williams's touchdown was textbook perfect, her aircraft catching the third arresting wire with exactly the right angle and airspeed. Her post-landing radio transmission carried excitement that Jake remembered from his own early carrier. Operations: Tower, Ghost Rider 207, first solo landing complete. That felt incredible. The successful completion of Williams's milestone represented more than individual achievement. She was part of the first generation of naval aviators trained entirely under curricula that incorporated lessons learned from Jake and Sarah's emergency recovery. Every aspect of her training had been influenced by innovations developed during that storm-tossed night in the Western Pacific. Jake's personal journey from panicked rookie to seasoned instructor had taken him through assignments that tested every skill he had developed during his emergency approach. He had flown combat missions over contested territories, conducted humanitarian operations in disaster zones, and served as a test pilot for next-generation carrier aircraft. But nothing had challenged him quite like learning to teach others. The mental preparation that had carried him through his own crisis. "Captain Thompson, you have a priority message from Naval Air Systems Command," announced Communications Specialist First Class Jennifer Chun, handing Jake a classified communication tablet. The message contained details about his next assignment that would complete a circle that had begun. During his emergency approach, the communication authorized Jake's selection as Project Officer for Development of Artificial Intelligence Systems, designed to assist air traffic controllers during emergency situations. The program aimed to create technology that could provide the kind of intuitive guidance that Sarah Martinez had demonstrated during crisis conditions. His unique experience as both recipient and instructor of emergency recovery techniques made him the ideal candidate for bridging human expertise with technological advancement. Meanwhile, across the continent at the Pentagon, Admiral Sarah Phoenix Martinez was concluding her final briefing as Director of Naval Aviation Safety. Her promotion to flag rank had been accompanied by responsibilities that influenced every aspect of carrier aviation throughout the fleet. The safety programs she had developed were credited with reducing carrier aviation accidents by 40% over the past 3 years. The most significant lesson we've learned is that excellence in emergency response comes from systematic preparation rather than individual heroism, Sarah explained to a gathering of international military aviation leaders. The techniques we've developed can be taught, practiced, and refined until they become automatic responses during crisis situations. Her presentation included analysis of emergency recoveries conducted worldwide using procedures derived from her original guidance during Jake's approach. The Martinez method had been successfully employed in situations ranging from mechanical failures to weather emergencies, with success rates that exceeded traditional emergency response protocols by significant margins. The NATO Maritime Command had requested Sarah's consultation on developing standardized emergency procedures for multinational carrier operations. Her expertise had become so respected that allied naval forces sought her input on everything from pilot training curricula to equipment procurement decisions. "Admiral Martinez, how do you assess the current state of emergency recovery capabilities compared to conditions 5 years ago?" asked Captain Henrik Storm Larsen of the Royal Norwegian Navy, whose own pilots had been trained using modified versions of her techniques. Sarah's response reflected both pride in accomplished progress and realistic assessment of remaining challenges. "We've made remarkable advances in both technology and procedures, but the fundamental requirement for calm professionalism under pressure remains unchanged. No amount of equipment can substitute for proper training and clear communication between aircrews and controllers." The International Symposium on Maritime Aviation Safety featured presentations from pilots and controllers who had successfully handled emergencies using techniques pioneered during Jake's recovery. Their stories demonstrated how innovations developed during a single crisis had influenced aviation safety practices worldwide. Commander Lisa Radar Park of the Republic of Korea, Navy, described her successful guidance of a damaged FA-18 through a typhoon using communication protocols derived from Sarah's original emergency procedures. The simplified instruction format allowed the pilot to focus on flying while I managed the complex coordination with ship operations, she explained to the assembled delegates. Similar presentations detailed successful emergency recoveries conducted by naval forces from Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, and France. Each operation had incorporated elements of the systematic approach that Sarah had pioneered during Jake's crisis, demonstrating the universal applicability of techniques developed under extreme conditions. The technological legacy of Jake's emergency approach continued evolving through research programs that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in carrier aviation. His current project involved development of predictive systems that could analyze weather patterns, aircraft performance and pilot stress indicators to provide early warning of developing emergency situations. The goal isn't to replace human judgment, Jake explained during a technical briefing at the Naval Air Warfare Center, but to provide information that helps controllers like Commander Martinez make better decisions faster. We want to give future air traffic controllers the same intuitive understanding that she demonstrated naturally. The artificial intelligence systems under development incorporated decision-making algorithms based on thousands of hours of analysis. From Jake's emergency approach, researchers had studied every radio transmission, every course correction, and every decision point to understand the thought processes that had led to successful recovery. Sarah's current research focused on training methodologies that could accelerate the development of emergency response skills in new air traffic controllers. Her goal was creating educational programs that could compress years of experience into intensive training courses that prepared controllers for crisis situations they might not otherwise encounter until later in their careers. We can't simulate every possible emergency scenario, Sarah observed during a recent conference on aviation training, but we can teach the analytical thinking and communication skills that allow controllers to adapt to unexpected situations. The specific procedures matter less than the ability to think clearly under pressure. Her training programs incorporated psychological research about decision-making under stress, understanding that technical knowledge meant nothing if personnel couldn't apply it effectively during crisis conditions. The curricula she developed were being adopted by air traffic control schools throughout the military and civilian aviation communities. The memorial dedication at Naval Air Station Pensacola honored naval aviators whose innovations had advanced aviation safety, with Jake and Sarah's emergency recovery featured prominently among legendary achievements in military aviation history. The ceremony brought together veterans and current personnel who represented decades of progress in carrier aviation. Their story reminds us that every flight carries the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before, observed Admiral James Anchor Patterson during his dedication speech. The techniques they developed during one desperate night continue, protecting lives every time aircraft approach carriers around the world. The gathering included pilots who had successfully used Martinez method procedures during their own emergency situations, creating a community of aviators whose lives had been influenced by innovations developed during Jake's crisis. Their presence demonstrated how individual achievement could have impacts that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. Lieutenant Sarah Williams approached Jake during the reception following the memorial dedication. Her flight suit displayed ribbons indicating successful completion of advanced carrier qualifications, achievements that had been accomplished using training methods derived from his experience. Captain Thompson, I wanted to thank you for the training that prepared me for my first deployment, Williams said. The confidence techniques you taught us made all the difference when I had to handle my first real emergency last month. Jake's response reflected the satisfaction that came from seeing his own survival translate into improved preparation for future aviators. Lieutenant Williams, that's exactly why we develop these training programs. Every pilot who benefits from better preparation honors the memory of those who learned these lessons the hard way. The cycle of experience, learning, and teaching represented the true legacy of Jake and Sarah's emergency recovery. Their crisis had become a foundation for systematic improvements that would protect future generations of naval aviators facing their own impossible situations. As Jake watched the sun set over Pensacola Bay, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a terrified rookie into someone whose experience could help others survive their own moments of crisis. The voice that had once guided him through impossible weather conditions now lived on through training programs that prepared controllers and pilots for challenges that previous generations had faced alone. The rookie pilot who had once panicked at Mach 2 had become proof that no situation is truly hopeless when faced with proper preparation, clear thinking, and the unwavering support of professionals who refused to give up on bringing everyone home safely. His story would continue inspiring future aviators who would face their own storms, knowing that others had survived worse conditions through skill, determination, and the kind of teamwork that makes the impossible merely difficult. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us